So I know Donna gave me two gentlemen, and I'm not sure if they made it tonight, but at some point, I'll try to collect up everybody that has signed up your address. And one gentleman needs a ride, lives on West Avenue, in Palmdale. Another gentleman lives on 6th Street East in Lancaster. So if you live in those vicinities, come to me. There might be a couple gentlemen that it worth leaving you to go pick up, bring here, out to the service, to bring back. Again, I think I talked about today, volunteers. Daryl's out of town. We'll be praying for him. Daryl Downs, Mount Street's out of town. We have a couple of requests for some prayers. Walt Schmitz dealing with some medical issues, so he was in Hatchby. We'll be praying for him. John Peterson dealing with some health concerns. We'll keep him in prayer. Lance Brown has a work schedule. Both a couple guys that have some work schedule conflicts. They'll be looking forward to meeting us on Zoom. And Wendell Tyler is also somebody that now is 24/7 full care, take care of an adult son, so he's going to be relying on Zoom. So coming into Zoom capability will be a blessing to some men that don't otherwise have the opportunity to join. My last announcement before him was for our table, he's not here tonight, Daryl Burks, but some of you guys know Daryl with the church. Him and his wife Amy are moving to Arizona. So their last week was this week. I was going to rouse him and roast him tonight, but he decided to skip them. Anyways, I have another thing. Approached me today that Jerry's, I think Dylan's about 20 years old. Approached me and said his mother had a heart attack and died. Wanted me, I told him that I would bring his name up in prayer here. He's devastated, doesn't know what to do. Young. A little louder now, but. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you got a young guy named Dylan that just lost his mother yesterday. Died, had a heart attack. 41 years old. What? Just 41? 41 had a heart attack. Grabbed a hold of her chest and went to the hospital and died. So that happened to him. Because of time constraints, I was going to go over the introduction and let people know exactly what the circumstances was for the church that Paul was talking about. Paul was writing to the saints in Rome. Paul was writing from Corinth at the house of Gaius. Dictated his letters. So Paul had Phoebe deliver these letters. But the strange thing about Corinth was in a cesspool of lust, prostitution, and crazy sexual exploitation. The problem with that is Paul heard about Rome, but Paul was not in Rome. So he had heard about it and really wanted to go to Rome. So when he wrote the letters to Rome, there were people like Priscilla, Aquila, and Lydia, and all these people that he knew that when Gaius Caesar had kicked the Jews out, when he died, they started to go back to Rome. And when they went back to Rome, that's why Paul wrote Romans 1:16, 17, and 18. It was a cesspool there. The Romans and the Greeks were heavy into sexual exploitation. They were heavy into streetwalkers. They were heavy into homosexuality. They were heavy into a lot of things that were even worse than Corinth. And some of these house churches weren't small house churches like we had. Some of these house churches were like full-blown villas, not 20 people. And some of them were 60 people. Some of them had up to 120 people that came into a villa and studied the Word of God. At that time, though, because some of these facilities were co-inhabited by both Jews and Gentiles, you had a lot of friction. You had a lot of friction between the Jews right now that believed in the Torah and the Messianic Jews that believed in the Torah and adhering to the circumcision at 8 years old and some dietary things. But you had the Gentiles that were saved by grace. They were regenerated people that had accepted Christ by faith and had accepted Christ as the risen Messiah that had forgiveness of sin, that gave their salvation, eternal destination. So I wanted to give you a little feedback of that. The first chapter that we went over was Romans 1, when we call it self-depravity, the depravity of man, where men cannot save themselves. That no one had an excuse when Paul was writing to the Gentiles, that they didn't have an excuse, and even though they didn't hear this, even though most of the Gentiles right now didn't know the Mosaic law, didn't hear the Torah, they, through general revelations and through their consciousness, had the moral law written written on their heart. So God was saying, even though you have it here, you still will be held accountable for your sin. And if you live by the law, you have abide by the law. Okay? So a lot of this, when we talk about this the Messianic Jews against the Gentiles, different cultures, different dressings, different everything, different. They were two completely things. There was another article that I read where at that time, after Gaius died, Nero became the emperor. Nero becomes an emperor. Now, Nero, later in his, he started out well, but later down in his reign, Nero set Rome on fire. And as Nero sets Rome on fire, guess who he blames?
Christians.
So now the Christians are being put on poles and used as light lanterns. They're put in the Colosseum and inside bears and lion skins, and they're being persecuted. So this is the same time that we have these house churches. So now you have these house churches right now that are preoccupied, occupied by the Gentiles mostly. But who do you think was turning the Jews, the Christians into the Roman authorities?
Paul.
Who?
No, the Jews.
It was the Jews. The Jews were not, because when Claudius kicked the Jews out, they disliked the Gentiles because they thought the Gentiles were a sect that were practicing sexual and doing exploitations and sacrificing kids and doing all that other stuff. But they held the Jews in higher esteem. So now the Jews right now, almost like when you talk about World War II, where right now some Jews turned the Jews into the German authorities and had them put in jail. Now you've got that going on back there. So now some of the Gentiles, because there was so much persecution going on, they had to have a code. So they had written codes. Now, I think we talked about this earlier in Acts, where we talked about the upper room. That when, I think his name was Rhoda or Rhoda, whatever her name was, that it was Mary's house, that when Peter knocked on the door, they waited for him.
With special knock.
Right, special knock. So there were codes that, because they didn't want to get persecuted, because at that time, if they found out that Christians were having a house church, the Roman soldiers would come in and raid the house and take everybody out and put them in jail, or have them killed or put in the Colosseum. That's the kind of environment that these people were in. Okay, so now we have, you might want to say, this was the beginning of what do you call that?
Semitism.
Right. So now you have the Christians that believe in the Trinity, that believe in the risen Messiah, the forgiveness of sin, but you have the Jews that believe there's only one God. Only one God. And they believe that Jesus couldn't have been a Messiah because can't be God's son. So you go and you look at it and you go, both of them thought, the Jews and the Gentiles thought they were both accursed. The Jews thought Jesus was accursed because he died on the cross and committed a sin and he was a criminal. Okay? It's in Deuteronomy. But the Jews,